Alright, in this video I'm going to go over our cerebral cortex areas. Now in the last video I went over the functions of the cerebral lobes, and I want to talk about the cerebral cortex areas. Now when you say cerebral cortex, there was a picture that we've already discussed the cerebral cortexes. The cerebral cortex area is this thin outer layer of gray matter that has neuron cell bodies. This is what we call the cerebral cortex area. So we can write notes on this. So we're on the cerebral cortex areas. This is going to be the thin layer of gray matter which is the outermost portion of the cerebrum. Now, we have many layers or many cortex areas that we're going to talk about. When you say something's the primary area is always going to be the main area of a lobe that is going to do something. So, when we talk about the frontal lobe is going to have your primary motor cortex. So when you say the frontal lobe's job is motor, the precentral gyri is the location of your primary motor cortex. Your primary motor cortex is how you move your hands, like how I'm moving now, primary motor cortex. Now it's also going to have the primary motor association cortex. Anytime you use the word association, this is going to be memory. So association, motor memory. This would be like if, again, I ask you how to serve a tennis ball, you'd be able to show me if you've played tennis. You have to have created a memory. So anytime you use the word association, it's going to be memory. On the picture, whenever I use primary motor cortex, I'll usually draw it as a 1 with a circle. And then anything that's a motor association cortex in that area, I usually just write AS for association. Now, your frontal lobe is going to also have your frontal eye field, which I'll just write as FE. Then you're going to have your broca's area. Oh, I did that wrong. Broca's area, which I'll just draw as a B. And then you're going to also have your prefrontal cortex. So these are all cortexes located in the frontal lobe. And I'm going to put a star by it. So I'll write out their functions on a picture, but these are the cerebral cortex areas. You need to know where they're located on the brain. Now, the parietal lobe is going to be involved with somatosensory. So, somatosensory cortex. So, we're going to have a primary somatosensory cortex area. That is in the parietal lobe, so that would be in the postcentral gyri. You'll see me draw a 1. And then you're going to have your primary somatosensory association cortex. Again, association is associated with memory. So an example that I give in class is if you put your hand in your pocket and you feel change, like quarters, nickels, and dimes, you could probably just feel the change in your pocket and know what kind of change you have in your pocket. You're like, oh, do I have a quarter in my pocket, or are my keys in my pocket? You know what your keys feel like. So somatosensory is general senses. If I ask you, what does it feel like to put a ice cube in your hand? You would be able to tell me if you have a memory. So anytime you have association, that's a memory. But somatosensory cortex area, the primary area, it helps you feel the sensation. So if you damage this area, then you won't be able to feel something that's cold at all. So any of these that are damaged is never a good thing. So these come really handy to know, like when you're talking about tumors. Okay, your parietal lobe. So now we have your occipital lobe. Your occipital lobe was involved with vision. So your cortex area's name is going to be your primary visual cortex. Your primary visual cortex is going to help you see. So if this is damaged, you would lose vision. Now, I could ask you what color I'm using for the occipital lobe. That's basically by memory, primary visual association cortex. By memory, what color did I use by memory to color code my occipital lobe? Well, it was green. Again, it's by recognition and memory. So if I grabbed any marker that I'm using, I could say, what color is this? You have a memory and you would say that's green. If you were looking at someone who came into your house, they walked into your house, you either recognize them or you don't. That's where the association cortex comes in. Okay, your temporal lobe is used for hearing. So in your temporal lobe, you're going to have your primary auditory cortex. So auditory means to hear. So primary auditory cortex, you can hear me talking. Now, if I whistled a tune, let's see if I can whistle right now. You're using memory to be able to recognize what tune I actually whistled. That would be your primary auditory association cortex. Again, by memory. That was Mary Had a Little Lamb. If I suck at whistling, I'm sorry. But I could play any song. I could play Post Malone, Sunflower, and you either recognize it or you don't. That's association. Okay. Your insula. Your insula is involved with taste. So we say that is your primary. The word for taste is gustatory. Gustatory is for taste. Gustatory cortex. So obviously you have a primary gustatory association cortex. I could ask you what dark chocolate tastes like. So some of you are like, ooh, gross, dark chocolate. You have a memory of it. That's the association. Now, I do want to mention one more that I did not talk about, and this is going to be where sense of smell is. So I'm going to change colors completely because your sense of smell is deep in your cortex, even deeper than the insula, in your limbic system. So I'm just going to write limbic system here because we will do the limbic system later. This is deep in the cerebrum. Not deep like the insula, but deeper. This is going to be where your primary olfactory cortex is. Olfactory means to smell. So your primary olfactory cortex is going to be associated with smell. So the word gustatory literally means to taste. So you're going to have to start learning these words. Your occipital lobe is going to have your primary auditory cortex. The word auditory means to hear. And all the other words we understand, hopefully. Visual cortex, vision. Somatosensory cortex. When you say somatosensory, somato means body. So these are going to be general senses. General senses are senses that you feel over your entire body. And then motor is going to be something that controls your muscles and glands. So everything comes from your frontal lobe that's a motor involved. Now, we do have a couple other areas that kind of overlap, or one primary one. that overlaps 3 different lobes, and that one is called Wernicke's. Wernicke's is part of your cerebral cortex. It's found in 3 lobes. This one is going to be used to help you understand and comprehend language. Understand and help you understand and comprehend language. So for Wernicke's, I'm going to draw a big W over the brain, and that'll represent Wernicke's. So we're going to start with my picture, a new picture that I drew out, and I'm going to label these because you need to know where these are located. A lot of pictures on this chapter. All right, so we're going to start with the frontal lobe. The first area that we're going to talk about is your primary motor cortex. So, primary, you draw a 1 with a circle over it, and you should know where these are located. So, your primary motor cortex is going to be located in your precentral gyri. Now, the next one is your primary motor association cortex. That is going to be right in front of your primary motor cortex. So again, I just write association, but we know the frontal lobe is involved with motor. Now, along the temporal lobes, we have our lateral fissure. On the left hemisphere only, you're going to have your Broca's area, which is right here. It's in the left hemisphere only, so this is the left hemisphere. And then just above that, you're going to have your frontal eye field area. Okay, and then one other area that we'll put a star, this is your prefrontal cortex. This is going to be your personality. So the first thing that we talk about when you understand the lobes, the first thing is your frontal lobe is always going to be your motor functions. So you could write that on here. Frontal lobe is always going to equal your motor cortexes in different ways. So, the first one I want to talk about is your primary motor cortex, which is right here. Primary motor cortex is located in your precentral gyri. This one is going to help you plan and execute movements. So if I wanted to grab this marker, I use my primary motor cortex to grab it. Now, your primary motor association cortex is going to be involved with muscle memory. So if I ask you to pretend to shoot a basket, like using a basketball, or to pretend that you're batting, this would be your primary association cortex. Primary motor association cortex. This is going to give you memory. Again, these examples. It helps you remember how to shoot a basketball. Flip a coin. It's memory. That's just some examples. All right, so I'm going to turn the page sideways so that I have plenty of room for the temporal lobe. And I want to talk about your Broca's area. Which is written as a B. Let me get a different color red. Maybe this will be a little brighter. This is in the left hemisphere only. Now, the word in Espanol for mouth is boca. So, Broca's area is going to control motor movement to the mouth. This is going to help you with speech. So this is motor control to the mouth. Broca's area. Okay, the next one is your frontal eye field. This is in both hemispheres. It's just above your Broca's. Frontal eye field, this is motor control to the eyes. To help you move your eyes up and down. Frontal eye field. It's in the frontal lobe. Okay, the star represents your prefrontal cortex. This is your planning. Personality. So again, if you don't like someone's personality, you don't like their frontal lobe. Something I will say about this prefrontal cortex and personality is that you develop this as a child, but if you get a tumor right here, your personality completely changes. So an example of this, when talking about the personality of someone, if you asked your sister, if your sister asked you, does she look fat in a certain dress? You have no personality. If you get a tumor right here, you'll be like, yeah, you're fat. Like, you have no filter. Another thing about prefrontal cortex, if you've ever seen the movie Saw 1-8 or whatever it is, the guy who was responsible for murdering people had a frontal lobe tumor, and he basically felt like he needed to, do all these bad things to teach people lessons. So having a tumor in your frontal lobe can really mess with you, and I guess technically that could happen. So it's your higher cognitive functions. When we say higher cognitive functions, this is also going to be like decision making. So if you make bad decisions or bad choices, that's your prefrontal cortex failing you. Also judging consequences for whatever you do. Like if you decide it's a good thing to, like I said before, steal from a grocery store or get caught cheating on a test or whatever. This is what guides you. So these are all in the frontal lobe. So you have Broca's, again, which sounds like boca for speech. Boca means mouth. Frontal eye field tells you it moves the eyes. Your prefrontal cortex is planning, personality, higher cognitive function. Now I'm going to turn it back this way. Your primary motor cortex is located in the precentral gyri. That could be a fair test question. Where is it located? This is going to help you plan and execute movements. The plus is and. And then your frontal lobe in general is all motor except for your prefrontal cortex. I'm rewriting over these for you guys. Primary motor association is located just in front of the primary motor cortex. It is muscle memory. I'm not going to write that one. All right, so now we're going to move on to the parietal lobe, which is blue. Now, your primary somatosensory cortex is going to be located in your postcentral gyri. So we can put a 1 and circle it in the postcentral gyri. And then your association cortex is going to be just behind it in the rest of the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe is your somatosensory cortex. Your somatosensory cortex. So primary is in the postcentral gyri. This is going to help you interpret body senses. We only have 2 types of senses, so body senses are general senses, and you should be able to give me examples of those. All right, then you have your primary, somatosensory, association cortex. So the word association literally means memory. This helps you recognize the sensation that you're interpreting. Example of this, you put an ice cube in your hand. Even if your eyes were closed, I closed my eyes, I put an ice cube in your hand, you would say, that is cold, and it's an ice cube. Now, how did you know it was an ice cube? What other sense would you detect? You would say, it's wet. So, again, association is by memory. So your parietal lobe is always going to be somatosensory. Cortex areas. So now we're on to the occipital lobe. We said as a general rule of thumb, the occipital lobe is involved with vision. So, in the back right here, just this section, that's your primary visual cortex, and the rest of the occipital lobe is the association cortex. So again, association, as soon as I say association, you should say memory. So, your primary visual cortex. This is going to help you with vision. Vision is eyesight. Okay. Association, ASS. Primary, visual, association cortex. What color am I writing in? Well, first of all, you have to see it using the visual cortex. So it helped you recognize the color. So it's memory. Helps you recognize objects, color, objects, people. It's based on memory. You have to have seen it. So your occipital lobe is always for vision. So we have the temporal lobe. So we're going to have a primary auditory cortex and your association. So we'll put a 1 and association. Ass. All right. Primary auditory cortex. What does auditory mean? Hearing. So you hear. If you get a tumor in your primary auditory cortex, you can't hear anymore. You lose the ability to hear. So your primary auditory association cortex, anytime you say association, that's by memory. It helps you recognize what you hear. Music, language, a little bit. Now, the insula. The insula is deep, you can't see it. We said it was involved with taste. So this is your primary, the location of your primary gustatory cortex. Gustatory means taste. Insula is involved with taste. Auditory is your temporal lobe. Your temporal lobe is for hearing. All right, so we had one other area that we talked about, and that was Wernicke's. So Wernicke's, when we talked about the layers, and I did write them out, Wernicke's is found in 3 lobes, and it's used to help you understand and comprehend language. So Wernicke's is going to help you basically hear language. So it's going to be a little bit in the temporal lobe. It's going to help you read language, so a little bit in occipital lobe. But you have to be able to know how to place your tongue in your mouth to say words. Like, yo quiero unos zapatos, or to roll your R's. La paria. No, that's not rolling my R's. Ruffles have ridges, like rolling your R's. That takes somatosensory, feeling where your tongue sits in your mouth. So if you can't roll your tongues, you don't have memory from it. So it's kind of hard to do. So your Wernicke's, oh, you can't see that really good. It is in 3 lobes. Wernicke's is a cerebral cortex area found in 3 lobes. It helps you understand and comprehend language. Now, I wish I could say that we were done with the cerebrum. When we talked about the cerebral cortex areas, you have to remember that the cerebral cortex area is just a thin layer of gray matter. So now we're going to talk about structures that are very, very deep in the cerebral cortex. We're just talking on this outer layer when we say cerebral cortex. So your primary motor cortex is just in this outer layer. So this would be the location of everything. There'll definitely be some questions, but we need to cover things that are deep in the cerebral cortex. So remember, the cerebrum is the largest and it's got the most functions. So these are cerebral cortex areas, this outer gray matter that we talk about, the cerebral cortex areas. Now we're going to talk about two things that are super deep to the cerebral cortex called our limbic system, which we briefly talked about. Our limbic system is deep in the cerebrum where our primary olfactory cortex is going to be, but we have other things with the limbic system. But we're also going to have nuclei. We're going to have things called basal nuclei, and a nuclei is groups of neuron cell bodies that are deep. So we're still on the cerebrum, and I have more pictures that go with these. So I'm going to stop, and we're going to do the structures deep in the cerebrum. We're still on the cerebrum, and that's where we will pick up.